What happens when integrity is missing from a culture? And if and when it returns, what kind of benefits actually are found when integrity is really something that is seen as being significant? I want to talk about an Old Testament book and the time we have together on this occasion, just actually part of it. The book is the book of Ezra in the Old Testament. And it talks about the return of people out of Babylonian captivity, Babylonian bondage, back into the area of Judah to rebuild Jerusalem. Prior to that, you find if you go back and think about the history of the children of Israel, after the death of Solomon, that nation divides into two kingdoms. It's not a united kingdom anymore. Israel in the north is governed, first of all, by Jeroboam, who does not want the people to go back to Jerusalem. He does not want the people to actually succumb again to following the law of Moses. He thinks that he'll lose his kingship if that happens. So he sets up idol gods in the north and the south and tells the people, these are the gods that brought you out of Egypt. Don't go to Jerusalem. From its very inception, that northern kingdom of Israel, with 10 of those tribes of Israel, was following idolatrous practices, not just with those 2 idols that Jeroboam set up in that kingdom, but with embracing the gods and goddesses of nations around them. They were idolatrous from the very inception to the time of their demise at the hand of the Assyrian Empire. You read about that in 2 Kings chapter 17. And the Assyrians actually took the best of the people, the wealthiest, the most educated out of that northern kingdom and brought in people from other nations, from other cultures. And now there's a mix. Eventually there's an intermarrying between those other tribes of Israel who are left there in that northern kingdom and people from these other nations. The Samaritans actually are the outcropping of that, the end result of that. And in that first century, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when you read about the ministry of Jesus, that term Samaritan shows up. The area of Samaria, the majority of that area that had been at one point in time, that northern kingdom of Israel. And the Jews, those who could trace their genealogy, could not stand the Samaritans because they looked upon them as not really fully Gentile, but by no means were they of Israel. Historically, by the time you get the last 2 chapters of 2 Kings, the southern kingdom of Judah falls, not to the Assyrian Empire, but to the Babylonian Empire. And they are in that captivity in Babylon for 70 years. And then there's a change. The Babylonian Empire falls, and Persia now becomes the empire that's a world power. The very, very end of 2 Chronicles, the statement is made that Cyrus, the king of Persia, makes an edict, a decree, and allows Jews who are willing to do so to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild it, rebuild the temple especially. And as you read through Ezra chapter 1, there are almost 50,000 Jews that actually make that journey from Persia back to Judah, to where the city of Jerusalem once stood. It's standing now in ruins. And in chapter 3 of Ezra, when the 7th month had come and the children of Israel were in the cities, the people gathered together as one man to Jerusalem. Verse 2, verse 3, they built the altar of God of Israel. They built the altar that used to be present there in front of the temple. They actually began observing the feast days of the Jews. In fact, the statement's made in verse number 4, they kept the Feast of Tabernacles. It commemorated their deliverance from Egyptian bondage. Verse 5 and verse 6, they began those sacrifices that had been commanded in the law of Moses. They started embracing that again. And the beginning in verse number 7, all the way down through the end of chapter 3, it's the preparation, the planning, the gathering of materials, the assigning of responsibilities to individuals to rebuild the temple of God that once stood in Jerusalem. And the statement's made in verse 10 that they laid the foundation of the temple. And the younger individuals are elated. Older individuals that may have come back with them in that journey weep, maybe out of joy, maybe out of remembering what was lost those decades ago. But some interesting things happen in chapter 4. In chapter 4, verse 1, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the descendants of the captivity were building the temple of the Lord God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and the hands of the father and the heads of the fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you. For we seek your God as you do. We've sacrificed to him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. We're not really Israelites. We were placed here under duress. We've been living here since the time of the Assyrians. We seek your God as you do." It's partially true, but not totally. When these people were brought into that northern kingdom, as it's recorded in 2 Kings chapter 17, when these people are moved back into this land, and many of the 10 tribes moved out back to captivity, those who are left, they feared the Lord, yet they served their own gods according to the rituals of the nations from among whom they were carried away. 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 33. So when they make the statement to these Jews that returned that, well, we seek your God like you do, we appreciate your God just as much as you do, we have been serving your God or following your God ever since the Assyrians brought us here. Partially true, but you've been serving everybody else you can think of. All these other gods and goddesses from all these other nations you serve as well. So it's not really a correct statement. Or maybe they don't know any better. The response in verse number 3, Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses of Israel said to them, "You may do nothing with us to build a house for our God, but we alone will build to the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." It's our responsibility. And we know something of your background, and really that your allegiance that you profess to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is really not an allegiance. It's allegiance to one of many gods. You've compromised all sorts of things. This really is a compromise. It's a compromise that's not allowed. Well, what's the outcropping of that? What actually happens after that or because of that? Verse number 4, the people of the land tried to discourage the people of Judah. They troubled them in building and hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. You're not going to let us help you? We'll do everything we can to stop you. In fact, the way the New King James translates verse number 4, the people of the land tried to discourage, uses a Hebrew word that you find in Jeremiah chapter 38, which is translated weaken. And Jeremiah talks about weakening the efforts, or weakening the hands is actually the Hebrew phrase. It's the same phrase that's used here. It's translated, they tried to discourage the people. They tried to weaken them from their effort any way they possibly could, even hiring individuals to help create those kind of problems that these people face. It really doesn't stop the work. They continue. Beginning in verse number 6 and going down through verse 16, it's gone from compromise to coercion to try to get them to stop, now to condemnation. And they write a letter back to the one who is now the king of the Persian Empire. Verse 7, in the days of Artaxerxes, they write a letter to Artaxerxes, and what they say in that letter. Verse 12, let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem and are building the rebellious and evil city and are finishing its walls and repairing its foundations. They conveniently leave out, we wanted to help them build it when they got here, but they didn't let us do that, so we're going to do everything we can to stop them. Lack of integrity shows up in the very beginning of the letter. But it continues. In verse number 13, they say, let it be known to the king that if this city is built and the walls completed, they will not pay tax, tribute, or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished. How do they know that? Isn't that kind of a presupposition? Wishful thinking on their part? And maybe they're thinking, well, maybe that's happened in the past, so that's actually going to happen here. In fact, in verse 14, Because we received support from the palace, it was not proper for us to see the king's dishonor. Therefore, we've sent and informed the king. Talk about something that's false. We're getting money from Persia, and since we don't want anything to defame the king or hurt Persia, we're sending this letter. Again, conveniently leaving out, we wanted to help them build it, but they wouldn't let us, so this is what we're doing. What happens when integrity is missing? These kind of things happen when integrity is missing. The next statement that they make, down in verse 15, they ask the king to search the records, and you'll find that these people have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which cause this city was destroyed. They left out or were ignorant of a lot of details that caused that city's demise. What they're saying is these people, if they actually build this wall around the city, they're going to become strong. Well, now, wait a minute. The king of Persia knows and has record of how many people have gone back. It's not a force that's an overwhelming force, no matter what these people do. And this area of the country, if they can actually extract a greater amount of taxation, it's worse for Persia. If you analyze the letter of these malcontents, it really doesn't make any logical sense. They're just trying to stop the work. In fact, they do. Artaxerxes sends back a letter. And this is part of that letter, verse 21 to 22. Give the command to make these men cease, that this city may not be built until the command is given by me. Take heed now that you do not fail to do this. Why should damage increase to the hurt of the kings? He says, I've looked at the history and I see the way that they've revolted against certain things. Yeah, what caused the revolt? That's a good question. So the work stopped until the second year of the house of Darius, or the rule of Darius, king of Persia. Verse 24, thus the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, ceased, and was discontinued until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. What happens when integrity returns? You've seen some examples of what happens when integrity is missing. What happens when it returns? Well, in this next chapter, in chapter 5, verse 1 and verse 2, the people in Jerusalem, those who have come back, rose up and began again to build the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. In verse number 3, the one who is now the governor of that region came to them and spoke to them, saying, who has commanded you to build this temple and finish this wall? They give a very good defense about why they are there and their purpose and who gave them the instruction. It was Cyrus. Cyrus actually told them that they could go back and rebuild that temple. Well, the governor now sends a letter back to a different king, back to Darius. And he talks about the fact that these people have started doing this again. They were stopped. In fact, the construction had been stopped for over a dozen years. But they're starting to build again. But there's something different about this kind of letter. Because in this letter, he includes this. They gave us an answer, and we asked them who gave them the instructions they could do this. And here's what these people said. We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and completed. But because our fathers provoked the God of heaven to wrath, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this temple and carried the people away to Babylon. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to build this house of God. And also gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple that was in Jerusalem and carried into the temple of Babylon. Those King Cyrus took from the temple of Babylon, and they were given to one named Sheshbazzar, who he made governor. And he said, take these articles, go carry them to the temple site in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt on that former site. Now, what's the difference between this letter, where integrity is included, and that previous letter, where integrity is missing? This governor over that whole region that asked the Jews, why are you doing this, puts every fact and every detail into the letter that goes back to Darius. Because of that, Darius, when he receives that letter and analyzes all the details that are at his disposal, makes a statement to the governor. Verse 7 of chapter 6, let the work of this house of God alone, let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God on its site. Moreover, I issue a decree as to what you shall do for the elders of these Jews and for the building of this house of God. Tax money of those individuals that have been living in that area is be given to them. Plus, verse 9, whatever they need, let it be given them day by day without fail. Integrity, when integrity comes back, you don't leave out facts and details of a letter to those that are in authority. You don't hide evidence. You do not leave out what you were planning or you were endeavoring to do. Verse 13 of chapter 6 of Ezra. Then Tattenai, governor of the region beyond the river, and their companions, diligently did according to what King Darius had sent. They responded to that letter in a way where they weren't fighting against it. They were following it. What happens when integrity is missing? Details are left out. Facts are hidden. There's coercive action that takes place. There is condemnation that arises and becomes more and more intense. There are authorities that are brought into part of the picture, and those without integrity are conveniently leaving out details. What happens when integrity returns? People actually follow with justice and honor intact. Interesting passage. Interesting book. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.